Imagine what it would be like to leave your entire life behind and embark on a dangerous voyage across the open ocean at a time before GPS with only the wind to guide your sails. This was the reality for thousands of people during the 17th and 18th centuries, when candles were still used to light homes and reading and writing were a luxury afforded by the privileged few. The age of exploration, which began a couple of centuries earlier, kick-started a new era, one which was largely defined by international trade, colonisation and empire building. And the New World was the jewel in the crown, an expansive land, rich in minerals, which was made known to the Europeans in 1492, after a fateful voyage of one Christopher Columbus, when he landed in what is now known as the Bahamas. Over the coming decades, word spread that this new land was a land different from anything that was previously known, albeit a land not for the faint-hearted, for the dangers involved with getting there were apparent. Even so, settlers began to make the voyage over the rough Atlantic Ocean, braving storms, tropical diseases and potentially even pirates, just for the chance to start a new life in this land of opportunity. But here's the question: what was it actually like to make the journey? And more importantly, what awaited them on the other side? Sit back and relax as you find out what it was really like to be someone preparing to make this treacherous voyage. Life in Europe was very different back then to how it is today. There was the obvious lack of modern technology as well as infrastructure, and society itself was shaped differently. Europe was divided into several powerful empires, including but not limited to the British, the Spanish, the Dutch and the Portuguese, and each one was looking to stake its claim on the new world. The majority of people who left for the Americas did so out of necessity. Some were looking to escape from a life of poverty, whilst others were fleeing from religious persecution or political conflicts. And for certain people, the promise of land, opportunity and potential riches was irresistible, with the possibility of getting away from the tight watch of the European monarchies sounding to some like a dream come true. It wasn't uncommon for families of the time to sell everything they owned for a shot at a better life, and once the decision had been made, there was often no coming back. The journey itself was long and arduous, and so saying goodbye to friends or relatives was emotional and often meant saying goodbye forever, knowing there was a slim chance of ever seeing them again. This is not something that we're as familiar with today, due to how easy it is to call someone from the other side of the world, or how it's possible to get anywhere on the planet within a day or so. But back then, crossing the Atlantic meant at least a 6-week journey, and was sometimes as many as 12. Take a moment and put yourself in the shoes of one of those early settlers. Imagine you've made the decision to sell all your possessions to embark on a new life of promise. You're now faced with the prospect of at least 6 weeks at sea, being tossed about by the waves in a cramped, dark ship with limited food and limited water. On top of that, there was no guarantee you would even make it across, with your vision of a better future being the only thing driving you forward. Ships were often overcrowded, with somewhere between 30 and 100 crew members, and on top of that, the sleeping arrangements were poor. If you were lucky, you'd get a hammock strung up on one of the lower decks, otherwise you'd have to sleep on the bare wooden floor. A bit of money may have been able to get you something slightly nicer, although by modern standards it was very basic. As you can imagine, below the deck the air was thick. There was no such thing as privacy, and hygiene was at a bare minimum. The ship was filthy, and no fresh water meant that baths and showers were out of the question. That, however, doesn't really matter to you, given the time period. Washing was more of a luxury. Poor sanitation, coupled with a lack of fresh food, meant that disease spread like wildfire. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was common, but so were things such as dysentery, malaria and typhus. So again, imagine lying in bed on a cramped ship full of men coughing and babies crying, being tossed about by the raw power of the ocean. Perhaps you're familiar with the common saying of the day: pray for fair winds and a calm sea, for death lurks in every wave. For you're aware that if a disease didn't put an end to your journey, then a shipwreck just might. It's difficult to comprehend the true uncertainty that lies before you. As the days go by, they all roll into one, and each night that passes feels like an eternity. You begin to question whether you'll ever arrive there safely, and even whether this new land exists, or whether it's just a figment of someone's imagination. And at the moment when you think it's never going to end, you can breathe a sigh of relief as you hear the words you've been praying for the entire journey.
Land ho!
You've made it. Stepping out on the deck, you see the land moving closer and closer. However, you can't help but be struck by the vastness and emptiness of the coastline, especially the lack of any recognisable structures. The crew spring into action to prepare the ship for landing, and you can hear the prayers of the ship's pastor, thanking God for a safe and successful journey. After such a gruelling crossing, arriving in the new world is a relief, but you can't help but be struck by a deep feeling of both anxiousness and excitement, with one part of you raring to go and experience what lies ahead, whilst the other part is longing to grab a hold of the mast of the ship and never let go. The task ahead of you is no simple one. Although there were a few settlements along the coast in the early 1700s, many ships chose to land in largely uninhabited areas, or if they did choose to dock at a port town, which were often small and were mainly for storage and resupply, the settlers would likely move out from there into the wilderness to set up farms and largely live off the land. Life in the Americas was about survival. The right to the land itself was often given out by the colonial governments to those who were willing to cultivate or develop it, normally for use in agriculture, but the reality was that settlers had to build homes, clear fields, and hunt or grow their own food. Initially, many people lived in very simple handmade shelters, and each season brought its own challenges. Winter was particularly harsh. Depending on where you were, the temperatures often dropped below freezing, and food itself was scarce, with the threat of danger present in every moment, even from the wildlife. Think for a minute about how you would fare if you were faced with an empty plot of land, having to build your own home and live a self-sufficient life, with only a limited set of tools and a lack of knowledge and experience of this new environment. It took a great deal of faith and courage in order to not only face such a challenge, but to prevail against the odds. But for the settlers who made it this far, fortunately or unfortunately, they weren't always alone. Now, maybe it's a question that's been sitting at the back of your mind. The settlers weren't the first people living in the Americas. In fact, humans had arrived there thousands of years earlier, and so with all these Europeans arriving from the east, it's only natural to wonder what the interactions were like between them and the tribes who had called the land their home for generations. Now, that's a complicated question, and one which, as you likely know, is loaded with a lot of emotion on both sides. The reality, however, is that the relationship was one of both trade and cooperation, but also conflict and displacement. And in fact, it's not conducive to think of it as two opposing sides, considering that both the indigenous community and the European settlers were made up from multiple tribes and nations respectively, and at times both needed and feared each other. As time progressed, the New World as a whole became a patchwork of colonies, with each one having their own territory, culture and goals. It was a place fraught with rivalries which would often lead to violent clashes, leaving the individuals at risk of being caught in the crossfire, and as a result they could end up losing their homes, their lands, or even their lives. During the course of the European expansion into the New World, multiple alliances were formed and broken, both between the colonial powers and the natives. A newcomer could easily find themselves in the middle of a national or territorial conflict with little control over the outcome, for it was a time of great upheaval and social change. The world itself was just sitting on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, which was about to further shake things up and place us humans on a technological journey unlike anything we'd previously been on. But despite the difficulties and the large-scale changes yet to come, these settlers played a unique and pivotal role in the founding of the Americas, the effects of which are still visible today. It's important to look back with both respect and understanding, as it was a time in history which was very different and unimaginably difficult in comparison to what we face today, especially in the developed world. But we can see the result of not only the conflicts, but of the hard work of those individuals who dreamed of a new life and set out on an unimaginable journey in order to make that happen. Since the days of the early settlers, we've seen empires rise and fall, revolutions and wars, technological advances, but we've also seen the birth of great nations, which went on to change the course of history, and who knows what the world would look like today had these things been any different. So, after our brief discussion, I hope you're one step closer to understanding the hardships faced by the early pilgrims on their way to the New World. And after everything we've spoken about today, from the decision to go, to the journey, to the reality of life in such an inhospitable place, how do you think you'd cope if you were one of those settlers? Thanks very much for watching, and remember to like and subscribe for more. Goodbye for now.